Similar to how the home grinding market has absolutely exploded beyond comprehension, so has the dripper market. We have things like the SoFi, which I do appreciate by my friends Aramse. We have the Aurea. Look at that. This is absurd. What is the point of this? Is there actually that big of differences from brewer to necessitate kind of collecting them all like they're Pokemon? Gotta catch them all? What I want to start off by talking about is the different styles of drippers, and then kind of go through and kind of talk about, at least in my experience, the differences that one can expect from dripper to dripper, or from style to style. The big kind of bifurcation that I'm going to make is more so of percolation brew versus immersion brew. So with those, if we kind of split them on one side, it will look like this. Now, as you see, I actually have kind of three groups, and it's because this middle section is kind of like the ones that can't pick a side. Because this has a switch on it, it can do immersion and percolation. This one has a twisty bottom, it can do immersion and percolation. You kind of mix it up, and of course the switch base can do that as well. Now the Clever can, but it is largely used as just like a filtered French press. The Bird can do some different things, the AirPress obviously, but we're just gonna kind of look at that as immersion. These is kind of like the middlemen, and then these are like mostly percolation. Now some of these will have bigger bodies, like those that don't really use paper filters, versus those that, have really small holes in the bottom that are gonna really limit the flow going through it, versus ones that are gonna be heavy clarity, like a V60 or something along those lines. Now the flavor of, say, this is going to be closer to over here because they're using paper filters. With immersion, you're going to have a lot more kind of body into that beverage, and the reason for that is manifold, but if you don't have a paper filter, a lot of those oils that are usually filtered with paper are going to be there. You're gonna have a lot more kind of microparticles that make it through that can bolster that body experience, or that kind of texture experience in your mouth, and you're gonna have just a different extraction overall because you're not kind of plastering it with fresh solvent every few seconds to like redistribute the bed and all this different stuff in order to maximize extraction. And then, of course, when we add in paper filters, you have different thicknesses and porosities of our paper filters that kind of dictate the efficacy of them. So those come into play and can really change the game. But even when you're using paper filters, especially with immersion, you'll still get kind of a more cloudy brew that is a bit heavier, because a lot of those solubles, the colloids, etc., are able to really make it through that paper filter and into the final cup. That bolsters that body, and that really changes that cup profile completely. I would be absolutely happy with just a V60 and maybe just an AeroPress for travel purposes. Now beyond that, of course, there are the different geometries, so let's take a look at what that looks like. We have kind of like semi-conical here. We have conical right here. That's actually flat bottom, so let's put that back where it should be. Hybrid situation where these are all flat bottom technically, but they're not as straightforward as, say, these flat bottoms or these cones. So I have these kind of here because they're more no bypass style brewers. The flat bottom brewers, and over here we have more of that immersion style brew, which is again flat bottom similar to these. There is a very common understanding with flat bottom brewers that they give you a more even extraction than cone brewers. But in a specific test that was done in 2019 from Jonathan Gagne's book, Physics of Filter Coffee, under simulations where no bypass was assumed, it was actually shown that overall, conical drippers have a higher potential evenness of extraction than flat bottoms. Flat bottoms tend to extract very evenly that top layer, but as it goes through, it gets less and less extracted, whereas horizontally, the V60 is inferior to flat bottom drippers, but overall has a bit more even extraction throughout the whole bed. When no bypass is assumed, it looks like the V60 would actually give you that better or more even extraction.
Pour and then I'll swirl.
Now, what I have noticed is actually somewhat similar to the results of the UC Davis experiment of semi-conical versus flat. Now, in the past, and still, I've been very critical of that study, and I think there's a lot of holes in it as well throughout the methodology and as how they, actually carried out the experiment. But I think that across the board, for the most part, you will have a bit thinner body, a bit higher clarity, a bit, kind of more tea-like coffee, relatively speaking, to that specific coffee against the flat bottom brewer. I think you could dial in to a higher threshold a more vibrant, like flowery, tea-like coffee in a V60 or something along those lines than you could in a flat bottom. That doesn't mean you can't get almost there in these flat bottoms, and vice versa. I think this argument is similar to this whole cones versus flat debate in grinders. There are definitely different thresholds with each, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to get any clarity with cones and you're not going to get any chocolate with flats. That's absolutely not correct. Whenever we're also looking at these, we have to take into account these kind of hybrid brew methods where we're doing some immersion and some percolation. You have something like the Next Level Pulsar, you have the Oria V4, which has interchangeable bottoms, and you have things like the S-Works, which can give you the opportunity to turn off the flow by twisting the base of this. Now, these are very fun to play around with. You can really maximize extraction if that's what you're wanting to do. You can do the blooming period without wasting any water if that's the only time you're wanting to use. Of course, the switch base has been around for a while, which gave you this opportunity, but there was a lot of water that would fill the space below the bed, whereas these, you're able to keep all of the water you pour essentially inside, so you're not wasting any of that brew water throughout the process. So if we have kind of a spectrum of the most clear that you can possibly get from a brew over here, and then the most kind of balanced or heavy-bodied or sweet, whatever you want to say. And when I say sweet, we're obviously talking about specific perceptions. I still think the high clarity are really sweet. But anyway, I would say the cones kind of live over here, although you can come over here with cones. And then flat bottoms come over here, but it span all the way down to here. Whereas these hybrid ones, they do a similar range to, say, the flat bottom brewers, but they can get a little bit more intense. So if we were to add another axis to this, where it's like, all right, how intense of these different attributes can you really get? It kind of intensifies them. You're not going to get more clarity due to this kind of switch of the base, this kind of valve situation, but you're going to be able to intensify certain aspects based off of that. So being able to do a bit of immersion, being able to do a bit of percolation in one go is a fun thing, though it's not necessarily going to completely revolutionize or change your cup compared to some of these. Yes, you can increase the no bypass, which is going to allow for bigger ratios, but in the end, is it a necessity in order to completely transform or change your cup score by a full point or something along those lines? Arguably not. If you are addicted to, acquiring drippers and you feel the need to buy something new, well then I think this is all the representation you kind of need. I really enjoy something like the AeroPress because it's incredibly versatile, but I also really love the Clever Dripper. It is something that's so easy, anybody can do it, and it gives you cleaner cups than something that's completely unfiltered like a French press, and it gives you just a lot of options with a pretty big yield of coffee, and you can also transform it and use it just as a pour-over device, a semi-conical pour-over. There is some validity in saying getting something like that Cafec Deep 27 where it has that really deep angle so you can get a higher bed for smaller doses, but that's such a specific kind of situation. How often are you going to be brewing, 10 and below grams? If that's something you do often, then sure, something like that would be helpful, because the more shallow the bed, the more fines migration, the more potential clogging, the more potential bypass, the lower potential quality of the cup. So you want to make sure you're having a decent thickness to the bed. Something around 3 centimeters is a pretty good start, but in general, all of these brewers are going to give you kind of this 15 to 30 gram window. You can get bigger than that in something like a V60 or something like the Oria Big Boy, but for the most part, that's kind of the range we're working with. The more shallow or thin that bed is, the worse your brew is likely going to be, unless you have figured out some sort of hack in order to disallow as much of that migration, like maybe using something like a mellow drip or something along those lines that really helps soften the blow of the water onto those grounds. I have the big boy here from Oria because sometimes, if you're someone that brews every day for 2 people or 3 people, this is one of the few that can do that much coffee. Of course, the Chemex can, I don't have it represented here. Yes, it's not going to give me as much brightness as the Chemex, but consistency is much higher with this than I find with the Chemex. Now, this is a negotiator to kind of flatten down those paper frills in order to give you a bit better, less bypassed extraction. That's a bit more consistent as well. And then finally, I have something that's representative of flat bottom brewers, but smaller obviously, and something representative of conical. Now the reason I chose this S Works instead of the other ones is because it does have that option for the base to open up, but it also has a massive exit on the bottom, so you're not going to experience clogging or anything like that. You can choose different bases like the Oreo V4 in order to toss down into the bottom for different flow rates or different escapes. Now something like the Stag X or the Kalita have these tiny holes on the bottom where paper can clog it and cause for a really clogged, stalled out pour. Whereas this, that's never really going to happen because you have the whole bottom of the paper filter for it to release. I prefer playing with this than something like the Next Level because this has a bit more of a conical form to it, and I find that I'm able to get a bit more clarity through that cup and using the bed filtration here, which is a bit thicker of a bed with a smaller dose than I get with the Next Level Pulsar or something along those lines. But then the one that is the supreme for me, and probably always will be, because I keep coming back to it year after year, even after all this time in coffee, is just a V60. Now, of course, you don't have to get plastic. You can get a ceramic, you can get a glass, or probably my choice, if you're not wanting plastic, would be to switch actually to Brewista and get their Tornado. That's a double-walled glass one if you really want to retain a lot of that heat. It's pretty nice. It does a good job. Pretty much the same thing as a V60. This one has stood the test of time, and what I honestly see all the time are these people who get dripper obsessed tend to always come back to the V60. You watch any of these other channels like Brian Kwan, who absolutely loves playing around with drippers. He tends to brew mostly with his little Pepe V60. The workflow is something to take into consideration. You just toss it in, you brew it up, and you're good to go. I remember I was taught that there was actually a lot bigger learning curve to a V60 than like a Kalita. I would actually disagree with that. I get much more consistently good beverages from a V60 than I do from flat bottoms. Maybe a specific coffee would taste good super dialed into like the Kalita Wave, but in reality, I'm not ever going to hit 100% of a coffee's potential. That's just not going to happen. It's a fun thing to kind of chase. Maybe I get lucky sometimes and it happens, but I'm going to be doing what I know will be a good cup, make minor tweaks in order to improve that cup, but using the V60. Then you're just worried about your filters, which can vary greatly depending on the quality and the style of filter you have, which we can do another video on. But in general, when you do something like the Kaffic Light Roast, that's a really thick filter that's going to slow your pours down a lot. So that's something you could use for maybe a coffee that drains really quickly, or something you need more contact time with, or something with a really low dose so that it's not going to speed through and it has a high capability to absorb fines whenever you're pouring a lot. Or you can do like the medium dark roast filters, which are my favorite. They tend to be the most porous while also being really even in their texture, and they have a pretty fast flow rate while also being able to absorb a lot of fines without clogging up. You can do their dark roast one, you can do the Hario Untabbed, the Hario Tabbed, the Sybaris, which tend to be quite expensive but are incredibly high quality. You can take a look at the Kaffic Abaca, which are really nice as far from a sustainability standpoint. You can do something like a mesh filter, which will obviously give you a cup that's closer to something like immersion as far as that texture, because you're getting a lot of that silt, that kind of small fines through the filter into your final cup. A lot of those oils are going to get through you otherwise wouldn't get, the colloids, etc. You can play around with the feed rate into your grinder. You can play around with the temperature of your water, the ratio of your water to your coffee. All of these things I think should be played with before you run out and, turn to a consumer again and again and again. Although I know it's fun to acquire and to showcase all these drippers you have, we're just kind of urging the industry to continue to pump out this stuff for more and more consumerism, which we don't necessarily need. Let's take that 20 bucks we could buy a new dripper with, put it towards a nice bag of coffee, and you'll have a much better time with it. I'm pretty confident of that. Anyway, that is enough. I'm done ranting for the day. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was a helpful, insightful video. I hope it answered some questions for you. Of course, please hit the like and subscribe. That really helps the channel. I hope that you brew something tasty today, regardless of what dripper you use. And cheers.